Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Sheridan Blau, who will discuss his book, The Literature Workshop, Teaching Texts and Their Readers. Welcome to Rip Rap, Sheridan.
Thanks very much, Jim.
I must say, we were talking about this just before the interview started. Your wonderful book is terribly frustrating, even confusing. But before our viewers get an impression that somehow I'm insulting your book and you by making this comment, please explain why I hope, you regard this as a compliment and even crucial to the style of teaching literature that you advocate.
Well, it's half a compliment. And also, I don't think you mean it. I don't think you mean my book is actually confusing and frustrating. But I think what you're talking about is that my claim is that the job of a good English teacher, a good literature teacher, is not to avoid confusion, but to promote it. And my argument is that that we learn from confusion. We learn from our questions. And in fact, one of the principles I argue for is the notion that confusion represents an advanced state of understanding when you're reading literature. When you're reading literature, often it's true that you'll read a text and you think you understand it, and then you look more closely and you see problems in it. There are things that create confusion for you. And it's in those places that you find things to learn. You find new ideas. I also argue that the only text worth reading are texts you don't understand, because those are the ones that have something to teach you. So I'm promoting the idea that the teaching of literature ought to be a place where we look at problems and look at puzzles, look at places where we feel confused, because those are the places where we're going to learn something.
Well, I certainly meant it as a compliment of the supreme kind, and I really liked your book. I thought it was really wonderful. And as you said, you're starting to look at teaching literature as a process, and maybe you can explain how teaching composition is starting to be viewed as process. But this is a relatively new approach.
Yeah,
to
actually, there are
literature.
people who have said this for a while. I think I'm trying to make it applicable in the classroom, find ways the students can see that reading literature is a process. Yeah, we know that writing is a process, that you start with ideas. That we talk about writing being messy, and we talk about how writing is mainly a process of revision, that nobody can write anything decent by just writing it down and getting it down, but that you have to start somewhere. Ray Bradbury says you have to throw up in the morning and clean up in the afternoon. That's how his writing process works. And I think every writer knows that. Kids don't know it, and kids have to learn it, and they can learn it in elementary school. There's a famous essay, I think it's called something like Sarah or Susie Learns to Make Writing Hard, that kids learn that you get it down, you make a sloppy copy, and then that starts to think, so you can start discovering your ideas. Well, we haven't talked much about how reading is a process just like that. In fact, one of the things I say in my book, and like to say at workshops, is that reading is more like writing than writing is. That in writing, sometimes students will revise something and make it worse, but in reading, revision is always to your advantage. So my argument is that, yes, we need to look at reading as a process too, in which the first reading is like a zero draft. You're just starting to get a sense of what's going on in this text. And then you have to look again and see things more clearly and change your mind about what you're looking at. And that it's a process. It's like peeling an onion in some sense to get at what's going on in the text. And that good readers do this and expect to do it. And that poor readers expect, when they look at a text, if they can't get it right away, they assume that they can't get it, that's above their reading level. In fact, one of the principles I articulate in the book is the notion that the difference between strong readers and poor readers is that strong readers have a greater tolerance for failure. A good reader is more willing to read a text and say, I don't understand this, and come back to it, keep working at it. Whereas a poor reader looks at the same text and says, I can't do this, this is above my reading level, and quits.
Well, in a number of times throughout your book, you make the point that the students think that somehow the teacher just has this magic ability to put their hands on the text and say,
"That's right.
This is what it means."
That's right.
And they don't understand that the teacher
that we struggle too.
That's
yeah,
right.
That any text that's worth reading was difficult for us, and we had to go through a process to read it. And the problem is that, well, it is like the teaching of writing too. I talk about the example of the kids who have no writing experience who come into a college course and look at a manuscript like Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and see words crossed out and words written in the margins and say that Jefferson, he didn't know how to write. Because if he knew how to write, they say, he wouldn't have made so many mistakes. And they have to learn that writing is a process. Well, I think students do the same thing. They see teachers delivering lectures that represent very sophisticated readings of difficult text and think that the teacher, that's the way he must have done it. He read the text and then was prepared to say all these things about it without recognizing that that teacher had to struggle and work hard and maybe spend 30 years trying to figure out the poem and say the things he says about it. But as teachers, we're not used to, in fact, showing students that struggle. And so I'm encouraging teachers to show students themselves struggling through text, or at least give students the experience of struggling with the text themselves with the support and coaching of a teacher.
Well, that's the point, too. You're shifting the position of what happens in the classroom to getting the student to take the responsibility, understand what it is to work through and find the meaning.
Yeah, that's right. This comes from an early experience I had in which I started realizing that almost everything I do to get ready to teach a text would be better done by my students. As they'll learn more if they do that rather than if they hear the product of my having done all that work to understand the text. Let them do the work.
I think it's important, too, to point out you've got quite a background. We can talk a little bit about that in terms of the writing project and, writing and literature, and you're involved with the National Literature Project. Maybe give a little bit of your background of this.
I come out of a writing project. I was the director and founder of our writing project, which is a site of the National Writing Project. And the writing project is important to the way I work. Let me see if I can explain the writing project is a community of teachers who share their best practices. And most of what I do in this book is present literature workshops I conduct with my students, and workshops that I conduct with teachers that really developed out of my work in the writing project. And I guess the way I can explain the principle best is to say that the writing project brings teachers together to demonstrate their best practices to one another, but it also asks that those teachers reflect on what's behind their practices, the theory or rationale for their practices. And it's through the writing project and through that approach to teaching, to demonstrate a lesson, to show what practices, what principles were behind it, that made me realize, well, two things. One is that in my teaching, I needed to conduct workshops. I needed my students to develop workshops so my students can have an experience in order to learn the principles and ideas about literary text that I want them to learn. And then those kinds of experiences I was developing for students, I was demonstrating to teachers in the writing project. And the way the book grew out of that process was when I sat down to write the book. I first started writing it for a very academic audience and tried to write for my colleagues. And it was very laborious, and yet I realized that how come I'm writing so laboriously, trying to write this text for my colleagues when I do workshops about these same topics so fluently and so comfortably. And I made a decision early I took a sabbatical to work on this book, that I was going to try to recreate the workshops I conducted for writing project teachers and the workshops I conducted for my own students in classes in the book. And so the book is a set of literature workshops, but it tries to recreate, to dramatize the actual workshops I conduct in classrooms and in workshops for teachers.
Well, that's what I found fascinating. It actually has several layers to it. I
it's hard for me to
expected
talk
more
about.
of a narrative, but there are really these different dynamics that are going on that you portray when you study different
Well,
parts
it freed me, actually. Having decided to do that was very freeing for me, because I could do the representation of the workshop, say the kinds of things I usually say to teachers. And what I suppose is new in there is I then have the voices of my students or the voices of teachers coming in. And I do have videotapes and notes, and a lot of it's constructed from memory. But in a workshop, I also then stop and reflect on what we've just done. Did you see today's workshop, in fact?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you see, I do the workshop, we do the activities, we work on the text in certain ways, and then I stop and say, look, this is why we just did this. Here are the principles that are behind our practices. And I do that in an ordinary workshop. Well, I did that in the book, too. I could stop and say, here's why we just did this. But in the book, I could do it at greater length. And so I could write more about why we were doing it and think more theoretically. And that was liberating for me, because it let me think about those ideas more and discover more about what I had to
And
say.
you had
And
multiple voices. I mean, that
yeah,
was
there are
really
multiple
true.
voices, I guess. So
And there's another aspect of it, too, that with the writing project, it was that the teachers do not teach something that they don't actually use themselves.
in the writing project, the principle is right. You never demonstrate anything that you don't do. You never go in and show people something they should do. You only show what you do.
And I liked also the fact that that was based on experience, the prototypes that you were talking about. And you had that one experience about teaching Macbeth in the book.
The story about Macbeth? Yeah, you want me to tell that story?
Sure, yeah.
It was a classroom. I was watching a teacher teach Macbeth, and I came in before the class, and he showed me the textbook and the scene he was going to teach, and I read it quickly, and I saw there were 8 or 10 lines I didn't understand in it, but I thought, well, I'll watch his class, and he'll probably go over them. And he went through the whole scene teaching his students, and he was a brilliant teacher and really went through the scene line by line, except he skipped the 8 or 10 lines at various places that I didn't understand. He did every line except the few I didn't understand. And at the end of the class, I told him what a great teacher he was, and I said, but isn't it ironic that I had some trouble with this scene, and there were a few lines I couldn't understand, and you did every line in the scene except the few I couldn't understand. And he said, well, I didn't understand them either. And so I asked, the first question, I said, well, what do you think the students thought? And my assumption is the students must have thought they were the easiest lines because they're the only ones that the teacher didn't bother teaching. But the interesting thing was that he and I sat down at the end of the class after we realized this, and we looked through those lines and worked on them. And they turned out to be the most interesting and valuable and informative lines in the whole scene. That is, the process of working out what those lines said was more illuminating to us than any other part of the scene. And from this I draw the principle, that's where I draw the principle that the only texts worth reading are the ones you don't understand. But I also make the observation that this condition is sort of the condition of footnotes in text, that teachers are used to this, that they're teaching a text and they have footnotes to lines they can figure out, but there are no footnotes to the lines they can't figure out. And because, in fact, editors don't often say, nobody's ever figured out these lines, we don't understand these lines.
I think that's
but they're the rich ones. They're the rich ones.
When you refer also to not only the literature workshop, but the literature, the literature laboratory.
Literature laboratory.
Yeah, and how it's in experiments. I thought that was a nice point.
Yeah, I think the idea is that what we need to do is find opportunities for students to learn not literary concepts, to learn how to solve literary problems, to learn what constitutes a literary problem, how to work on literary problems. And we do that, I think, not by answering questions, but by posing questions and posing problems and letting students work with us.
We just work through it with them. Yeah,
Absolutely.
That was a fantastic point there. Perhaps you give a brief example of how the dynamics of a workshop and how you hope this model will develop autonomous discipline readers. I like that phrase. Autonomous
discipline reader, yeah. I said, you want an example of a workshop?
Yeah.
Let me think of one offhand. Well, typically, I'll tell you what I did with the faculty yesterday here at EMU. I brought in a long passage from Paradise Lost because faculty in the university were concerned. My book's mostly about teaching lower division courses, high school students and college students in the first 2 years of college. And I'd been told that a lot of the faculty at Eastern Michigan had read my book, and one of the questions that came up was, how does he do this teaching? How does he teach Milton or Shakespeare or Spencer using a workshop method? And in fact, there are some problems in doing that. And I'm teaching a Milton course right now, having some problems with my literature workshop. But I'm still doing it. And so I decided I would work on Paradise Lost. And what I did was I brought a really difficult passage from Paradise Lost to the group. And we had a group of 15 faculty in the room. And I passed it out to people. And what I asked them to do is to read it once to themselves. And then with partners, read it line by line to each other. And every time they have trouble, stop. And their job was to identify the problems they were having in reading that text. The idea was to look for problems. Where are the problems we want to work on? And then those are the problems we could talk about together. And of course they did that. They generated the problems, and then they told about the problems, and other people started talking about how they answered their problems and they solved the problems, and it became a workshop, a place in which we together focused on the actual problems we had in making sense of this text, and making sense of the ideas in the text. Sometimes problems were syntactic. How do you figure out what the lines mean? Sometimes they even had to do with language. What does this word mean? That's such a strange word in this context. Most of the time they were conceptual. And we worked through the text that way. And that's the simplest sort of form of a literature workshop. What are the problems? And then let's work on solving them together.
And I noticed there's a lot of, in the workshops in the book, there's a lot of interaction, like you'd set up something, but you also encourage people to talk with each other.
Yeah, that is one of the principles of the workshop. I mean, that I do, that it emphasizes collaboration. And the point of that's not just because I like collaboration. I mean, I actually like lecturing. I actually like telling people things. Given my way, I would just talk. And so I often said that literature workshop is my way of protecting my students from me. So they get a chance to learn something and not just listen to me. But the point of collaboration is that a lot of teachers will tell you that they really didn't learn to read text well until they became teachers. And the point of collaboration is that it allows everybody to be the teacher. Everybody in the group, to be a good teacher actually, to not to be the teacher who lectures, but to be the teacher who's listening as much as not. So collaboration allows the students to take that responsibility to figure out the text together. And with students who aren't quite so strong, one of the things it lets them do is realize how much progress they can make. I mean, that's one of the things that always amazes me, and students are always amazed by, is how much progress they can make in reading a difficult text when they read with a partner. I mean, nobody can notice everything about a text. So reading with a partner or two partners is going to contribute to what you notice. But it also means that that kind of dialogue allows people to discover. And the other fact is, of course, that students who are working on problems in text and talking about their own problems. Remember that most of what I do in the literature workshop is to say, identify your problem. I never ask people to say, what is it that you had to say that's so smart about this text? What are the big ideas in this text that you want to talk about? It's not about answers, it's about problems. And so when they talk about problems together and talk to each other about problems, what they're doing is thinking about their own thinking. And they're thinking about, why is this a problem? What difficulty am I having here? And we have a whole lot of evidence that one of the major differences between strong readers and poor readers is this process we call metacognitive processing, is this capacity to think about their thinking, to look at how they're thinking about this text and how this text is giving them a problem, and then try to find ways and strategies to figure it out. So by having students do that with each other, we're doing a lot of things. We're putting a premium on confusion, on having problems, instead of retreating from them, which is what school usually does. We're helping people learn how to think about their own thinking. And we're letting them discover that in thinking about their own thinking and working with other people who are just like them, the same kind of people, no experts here, that they can make real progress. And I think it gives them a lot of confidence about what they can do by themselves. And as I say, I think they learn to function the way really strong readers function by engaging in such processes.
It's pretty impressive that as that happens, people start affirming each other and their ability to respond.
I think that's true. I think it's one of the really interesting things I've seen happen is that students who might not think of themselves as so smart realize they can make a contribution.
As I told you earlier, my only frustration in the book is I really need like 3 or 5 hours. We don't do sound bites here. It's a half-hour program.
It's a good interview. You're a good interview, Jim. I enjoyed talking to you
Thank
about
you.
it.
But there's all these topics that I want to talk about, like you talk about intertextual literacy. Maybe talk a little bit about that, because that's an important part of your
it's not so different from what Hirsch calls cultural literacy. I didn't want to call it that because the term cultural literacy is so laden with certain kind of political overtones and is offensive to some people. But I wanted to deal with the fact that sometimes if you just don't have certain kinds of information, you can't read a text. And I think I do tell the story in the book of having my students work on a Sylvia Plath poem in which she talks about, it's called Lady Lazarus. And they knew that Lazarus rises from the dead, they knew that. And she talks about going down 3 times and coming back up, and she's an expert in death. And none of them were reading it as a poem about suicide. They were reading it in all kinds of ways, and I couldn't understand why they couldn't see what the poem was about until I asked them if they knew anything about Sylvia Plath, and none of them knew a thing about her. And I realized, of course, that I could read the poem as about suicide because I knew that about Sylvia Plath. And you have to recognize that often simple kinds of contextual information really frame a text for you. And I think as teachers, we often forget that. We often don't realize the kind of background we bring to something that enables us to know it. On the other hand, the other, I think, vice of a lot of teachers, and I've been guilty of this, is to think we need so much background that we come in and lecture students about all the background they need for the text, and sort of that background material simply washes the text, becomes a screen that keeps them from seeing the text. And so I think we need to exercise tact. We need to know, when is it really true that a student needs a certain little bit of background information in order to function with the text, and when are we overloading and making students in fact feel more dependent on us than they need to. And so I talk about intertextual literacy, about the texts that are behind text. And what I argue for is that if we're going to have students read texts that depend on their knowing prior texts, pretexts, as some people say, then let's provide them with the pretext. Let's not just tell them that we know about those pretexts. Let's give them the kind of experience that we had that enables us to know what we know. So as I give an example of a Wilfred Owen poem about the First World War, and that depends on knowing the Genesis story. Well, don't tell them about the Genesis story. Give them the Genesis. I mean, it's the Abraham and Isaac story. It's a very short story. You can read the Abraham and Isaac story. It's 50 lines. Give it to them. Give them a couple of other Wilfred Owen poems so they have an idea who this is. And so I guess what I'm arguing for is I think a lot of instruction ends up really mystifying students, having them think we're these literary geniuses who know these things, And I think we fool ourselves sometimes. I think the question we have to ask is, if I'm interpreting a text in one way, my students are not interpreting that way, I have to ask myself, how come I see it this way and they don't?
I really like that approach, that you're asking yourself those questions. So it's not only reflecting within the workshop, but the teacher is also reflecting on how the process is going.
Yeah, I think that's right.
You've got a fair amount of space in the book on interpretations. Maybe you can talk about that.
Well, interpretation is the heart of literary study. It's the heart of the humanities, of all the humanities. I argue that we live in a world in which we're interpreting all the time, and that the skills that we developed for interpreting literary texts are the same ones that apply to interpret human behavior, to interpret everything that happens to us in the world. And in fact, they pretty much define critical thinking. And the problem of interpretation, it seems to me, is it's the problem of moving between, I think, two extremes. On one hand, there's the reader, and what the reader brings to the text. On the other hand, there's the text. One wants to be honest and true to a text, and yet readers have different interpretations. But the fact that readers have different interpretations and different lenses and different perspectives on text doesn't mean the text can mean anything. And I think we're often caught in a world in which we have teachers and students who believe that text can mean anything, or they can only mean one thing. And my argument, and I have a chapter in the book on this in part, is that texts can't mean anything. That is, the ordinary rules of language and ordinary discourse exclude a whole lot of things the text might mean, but the fact that they can have multiple meanings, on the one hand, doesn't mean that they mean everything, but it also means that they don't necessarily mean one thing.
Every good conversation must, unfortunately, and with real regret here, come to an end. I've thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to talk with you about your book, The Literature Workshop. But if I remember the way you teach correctly, I think you'll want to leave our viewers, especially those who teach, with some thoughts to reflect on about the dimensions of literary competence in teaching literature, especially the three different forms of literacy: textual, intertextual, and performative.
All right, I'll try to do this without saying a lecture. I talk about three kinds of literacy that students need to be literate and to when I say literate, I mean to function the way highly literate people function, and I call them textual, intertextual, and performative. And by textual literacy, I simply mean the kind of literacy that allows you to move from a reading of a text to saying, what does it say, what are the facts here, to an interpretation, to make that interpretive move, to say, here's what I see on the surface, and to start recognizing that you have to often look behind the surface. And this isn't, again, mysterious. It's the kind of thing we do when we ask our children who complain to us about something that somebody did to them, well, why do you think he did that? To look at the motives behind human actions, so to make the interpretive leap. And beyond the interpretive leap, to make a critical to take a critical perspective, take a critical stance and say, well, what do I think of this? How does this apply? How do I evaluate this ideologically? Does this fit with my values? Is this realistic? Is this the way the world works? So it's those three steps of, we can call them reading, interpretation, and criticism. That's what I mean by textual literacy. By intertextual literacy, I mean the students have to have enough broad experience with a wide range of texts. For one thing, to know how genres work, to know that when they read a story, a fable in which animals talk, that one doesn't say, something's wrong with this because the animals don't talk. And to recognize that there are genres and expectations, and to read enough texts of different kinds to recognize generic conventions on the one hand, and the other thing to recognize is that to know the texts that are behind some texts, to know the Genesis story, to know the Abram and Isaac story so they could read about a sacrifice later. So that's what I mean by intertextual literacy. It's a lot, I have to say, it's a lot like what Hirsch calls cultural literacy. But the third kind of literacy, which I think is in some sense the most important, is what I call it sometimes personal literacy, and in my book I've called it performative literacy, because it's the literacy that enables you to perform, to function as a literate person. And here I'm talking mostly about habits of mind, about ways of proceeding. The first of which, for example, is the capacity to pay attention, to concentrate intensely over a long period of time. I mean, what I think is so amazing often about instruction is teachers will say, well, this kid doesn't get it. He can't read well. Well, what was he doing? He spent 2 seconds trying to read the thing. How's he going to get it? That is, if you're going to read something, it's just the truth of writing. You're going to write something, you have to work. You have to work very hard to read a difficult text. So the first dimension of performative literacy is the capacity for sustained, focused attention. Another one is, I call it a capacity, a tolerance for failure. That is, you can read and not get it, and then you have to read again. You have to keep coming back, so that the fact that you don't get it the first time doesn't mean that you're going to give up and walk away from it. Another one I speak of is a tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. That is, we have to recognize that texts are often uncertain. There are uncertain dimensions to texts. we're often not finished. We go away from the text, but we still have questions. You can't be a strong reader if you're going to say, as some students want to say, well, what's the answer? Let's have it. If we don't have it, something's wrong here. Maybe let me look at my list here. I forget all the dimensions I give. Capacity for sustained focused attention, a willingness to suspend closure, to keep working even though we don't have answers. You wait for answers. They may not come for a while. A willingness to take risks. It's very risky to offer a reading, but you don't want to just wait forever, so you offer a reading and take a chance. How about this one? You think that's what it is? That takes a certain kind of risk. You have to risk being wrong. You have to have another one I call is intellectual generosity and fallibilism. A willingness to hear somebody else's point of view that you hadn't thought of, and a recognition that your own view is maybe provisional and you want to have to let go of it sometime. And the other I call is metacognitive awareness, being aware of your own problems. So this set of what I call habits of mind are what I claim enable people to be strong readers. And what I'm arguing for is a mode of instruction that encourages those characteristics. And I guess what I should say is I think that a lot of traditional instruction discourages them. A lot of traditional instruction encourages students to think that there's one answer and that you better get it fast. I mean, think of how much instruction in school suggests that if you don't get this fast, there's something wrong with it. I want a fast answer. I want it quick. I mean, the whole idea of school, quick, what's this? Rather than to be thoughtful. In fact, there's some research that suggests that all of the qualities of mind that I claim are necessary to be a strong reader are qualities of mind that maybe schools don't discourage, but that kids discourage. Qualities of mind that are in fact that students want to avoid demonstrating, at least in junior high school. That kids at a certain age, they want quick answers. The idea that you may have to work hard at something is evidence that you're not too smart, that you want to be thoughtful, you want answers all the time. You want fast answers, no playing around, no thoughtfulness. So these are qualities that in some sense work against the prevailing culture. But I have to say that it seems to me that intellectuals and serious intellectual activity, people who at any stage in the history of humankind who have advocated thoughtfulness, reflection, deep thinking, looking behind the surface, have always worked against the general current of culture. And so there's a sense in which people who are literary and people who teach literature are always, if not subversive, at least in some sense countercultural. And it seems to me that it's our job to persist in that.
Well, you have indeed done that. It was a pleasure to have you on.
It was a delight. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.